Hello my friends, it's Gabriel with the Last Huntsman Outdoors channel here. I'm just going to go ahead and finish up and we're going to conclude the mid-size survival knife showdown series. We're going to conclude it. There's other tests that I wouldn't mind to do, but I don't want to drag this video series out for any longer, and I've been working on it for over a month now. So I think it's best to just kind of see where we're at, and I think I kind of generally covered most of the bases on knives. So I'm just gonna kind of try to do this all in one big take, and just give the overall scores of each knife and how it did, and just kind of my own personal opinions on each knife. Now, also a couple things real quick. First of all, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. I appreciate hearing from you guys. And secondly, every knife here is a great knife. There's a reason why I picked these knives for the top 10 survival knife showdown series here, okay? So take all this with just a slight grain of salt. All these are great knives. They all performed greatly. It's just, this is kind of the battle of champions here. So we're going to start off with the good old classic Becker BK7. Now, as you guys may know, this was my go-to knife when I was in the Marines. I used to carry this knife with me. This is still the same one. I've had it for like 10 years. I really like the Becker BK7. It performed really great on a lot of things. It chopped really great. It has just perfect ergonomics. It did pretty good on slicing. It really good on batoning. All that. I think the couple things that really kind of harmed the BK7 is the value and the sheath. And both of those kind of go hand in hand, honestly, because the BK7 has such a bad sheath and you almost have to upgrade parts out of it. Upgrade parts for it right out of the box, that it just really kind of hurts the value. But even despite those two things, I gave it a 52 for its total score. Alright, next up we have the TRZ Apocalypse. Now, this is kind of one of those grail knives. This knife looks absolutely amazing. The fit and finish is phenomenal. Looks awesome. It definitely just deserves a title, Apocalypse, honestly. It's a cool knife. LMAX steel has a pretty decent choil on it. Ergonomics are so-so. I would actually say it's fairly decent for the ergonomics. The steel choice LMAX. Me personally, I like LMAX steel, so don't get me wrong. I think LMAX steel's a little overrated, quite frankly. All that being said, I think the thing that really hurt the TRZ Apocalypse, if there's two things that I would change on it, is I think it needs just a tad bit better edge geometry, and I could reprofile the edge on this and I'm sure it would perform great. But the second part of this is the value. Now, if you guys haven't checked it out, the TRZ Apocalypse is pushing a $500 knife these days, which quite frankly, for a production run knife, that's a little absurd in my opinion. There's custom makers that's not charging that much money for a knife. So with it being that expensive of a knife, it just really kind of hurt the value on it. And I think that there's a few things like the edge and such that could have been a little more refined on it. The TRZ Apocalypse, with all that being said, I gave it an overall score of 47. Alright, here we have the Reef Knives F6. Now, I like the F6. I heard Gideon's Tactical once describe it as if you took an SE6 and kind of blended it with a Becker BK2. that's kind of what you get with the Reef Knives F6, and I actually feel like that's a fair statement. Overall, it performed pretty well. It's more of a bushcrafty leaning knife than, I would say, a like combat knife, and I think that was one of the things that kind of hurt it a little bit, was it just didn't really lean itself very well for like a fighting knife. The handles being very smooth, I think, kind of harmed it a little bit ergonomically. Like ergonomically, it feels really great in hand. It feels just perfect. But when you start using it, that smoothness just, it starts to want to slip, and there's not really much of a end here to kind of hold on to. It's just slightly, but I feel like if they just kind of extended it just a little bit, or even gave this a lot more textured handles, it would help out a lot. And the fact that Reef Knives just doesn't offer the micarta grips. I know they're coming out with the micarta grips, but they won't offer it to people that's already spent like $400 almost for a knife. So to me, that's kind of a knock there. But overall, I really liked it. I gave it a score of 50. All right, next we have the ESEE6. This ESEE6 has been with me for quite a while. Not as long as the Becker BK7, but it has been there. It's just a keep on keeping on type of knife. It does a lot of really good things. You know, honestly, I sometimes wish ESEE did other things, like, you know, upgrade steel and stuff like that, but at the same time, ESEE does what they do really well, and that kind of speaks true with the ESEE6. So it didn't really super exceed at anything, but yet did really good at everything, and that's why this knife actually scored pretty high on all of this. It has a great sheath. The value, I think it's, you know, if somebody's just starting off and they're asking me, hey, what's a new knife that I can get into right now, I almost always tell them just grab an ESEE6, because like the ESEE6, you know, like I mentioned on the value part, is sub $150, and it's hard to beat that, quite frankly. I mean, there's knives that, you know, I've tested here that are more than double the cost of this, and this still outperformed a lot of them. So the ESEE6 is tried and true. So with that being said, I gave it a score of 59. All right, next up we have the Work Tough Gear Mountain Lion. This knife, it's definitely the heaviest and chunkiest knife here. However, you know, even on the slicing portion, it did really fine. It sliced better than even knives that are thinner, and, you know, should outslice this knife. This knife really does hit it great. Now, I will attribute that to a couple of things. One, the Aurora Borealis design here, I think, is just a really awesome design for a survival knife. And just Work Tough Gear, you know, they just put stuff together really good. Their fit and finish is phenomenal. Their edge geometry is phenomenal. So I have to give it to Work Tough Gear. I've always kind of been a little reluctant on Work Tough Gear, but I'll be honest, I've become kind of a fan of them just because of their quality and everything. The only thing that I think this knife kind of lacked on was it's not really much of a tactical knife, you know, and like I said on my tactical portion, I think every survival knife should have an element of self-defense. It actually has a lot of the characteristics that would make it decent, exception for it just didn't really stab very well, and it's a little on the heavy side. But that being said, this knife does just pack quite a punch for its size, and I would be glad to carry this in like a survival type situation. With all that being said, I gave it a score of 57. Alright, next up we have the Lion Steel T6. Now, the Lion Steel T6, definitely he has that more tactical oriented look, and it fulfilled that role very well. It's very light and fast in hand. I think it and the BK7 are, and probably the PBK Bush Bear, are probably the three best, more tactically leaning knives. However, this knife also performed really well as far as like chopping and other things, and quite frankly, this knife out-chopped, you know, even the TRC, which is a longer blade and heavier, and this knife still out-chopped it. So I was really impressed with the Lion Steel T6. It definitely feels great in hand, and it's pretty decent value for an Italian-made CPM3V knife. I was quite impressed with the value. If there's anything I would change on it, honestly, I don't know if I'm totally sold on this whole like canoe fitted in micarta grip. That being said, I've never had any issues with it. I've beat on this knife more than most people ever will, but I think personally I would rather just have a true full tang and just have that like extended pommel out there. So with all that being said, I really like the Lion Steel T6, and my overall score of it was a 58. Alright, next up we have TOS Silent Hero. Now, when this knife first came out, I instantly adored it and just wanted it right off the bat, so I ended up jumping on it. And I remember after I got one, they were hard to get for even like a couple years. I really like the Silent Hero. The ergonomics is kind of so-so, but it does actually work great as like a tactical knife. It does a lot of decent bush stuff. It chops pretty well, batons pretty well. I think the thing that really hurt this knife, and it's kind of the same thing that hurt the Becker BK7, is it just, the value is not there at all. It's almost worse than the BK7, and just because I was checking, and brand new, these things are, you know, pushing the $180 range, but then the sheath sucks, so you gotta buy a new sheath, and then you're starting to get into the price point of some of these higher end knives. And so Silent Hero kind of fell short on a few things too. All that being said, I gave the Silent Hero a total score of 44. Alright, here we have the Phobos Tier 1 BC. So, first of all, I have to say, Phobos makes some really awesome knives. They're innovative, and quite frankly, one thing that really kind of attracts me to Phobos is that they, you know, you kind of start to look at most knives, and they all kind of start to look the same. Like, I would even say maybe even the ESEE kind of starts looking like almost every other drop point survival knife. But the Phobos knives, they definitely just have like their own unique look to them, which is cool and all in its own way. And they have like a tactically oriented use for them, which is pretty cool as well. Now, the Tier 1 BC, it kind of fell short on a few things. One, while the leather sheath is just epic, I'll have to say I really like the way the leather sheath looks. It just doesn't retain the knife very well. So I think just a slight little revamp would have helped it with the sheath. And also ergonomically, it's definitely a tactical knife. But if you're like working with it for hours on end as like a bushcraft knife, I think you'd start to get some hot spots. And also with ergonomics, I don't know what it is, but the choil is just kind of awkward. Like, me personally, the way this handle is here, this knife did not even need a choil. If they just brought the edge all the way down to the handle with like just a small sharpening choil, this knife definitely, I think, would have been a lot nicer, quite frankly. It just, I don't know. I think a lot of knife companies like to put choils on knives that don't really need them, quite frankly. But all that being said, I still would highly suggest a Phobos Tier 1 BC. I gave it a score of 46. Now, here we have the Papa Bear knives. Bush Bear. This knife absolutely surprised me in a lot of ways. One, just it feels amazing. The ergonomics is on par with the Becker BK7. It's super light, it's nimble, it worked really great in the bush, and it was a great tactical knife. I honestly would have no problem carrying this on me in like a tactical type of situation, or if I was still in the Marines, or a number of things. I would gladly carry this knife. This knife would perform in that role perfectly. And you know, this was the thinnest knife here, and it still out chopped and, you know, did things better than some of these knives that were a little heftier than it. And the fit and finish is just perfect. I'm just super impressed with this knife. The ADCR V2 steel is just, I kind of generally lean on carbon steels, quite frankly, and the ADCR V2 is a very good choice for that. So honestly, this one really surprised me on how well it performed, and especially just comparing it to some of these others and such. And because I thought it, at first I thought it was a little out of its league because of its sizing, but honestly it did really great. So I, with all the scores added up, I gave it a 60. And you know, it didn't really good on some fields, but it also held its own really good in fields that it didn't do the best at. So all that being said, I gave it a 60, and we'll move on to the final one. All right, last, and like I said, least, just in cost and all that, Cold Steel SRK. Now, I will still 100% tell everybody, I think everybody and their brothers should have a Cold Steel SRK. I think the Cold Steel SRK is just, it functions too good, and it's just a handy little knife to have, to not have one. And you know, more often than not, you can find them for sub $50, and I've even seen them on Midway USA for $35. So, you know, for a chunk of SK5 steel from Cold Steel that's, you know, you can beat the crap out of it and it still keeps on trucking along, why the hell would you not have one of these as a spare? Ergonomics, it's okay, but I mean, it is a kind of a square blocky handle, and honestly, well, we won't get into that, but yeah, ergonomics, it kind of lacked a little bit, and it did kind of lack on some of the fine slicing, just because it is kind of a mid saber grind knife, kind of saber hollow grind knife, and so it didn't really perform on that as great. But you know, this is kind of meant to be like a survival tactical knife, and you know what, it does that really good. So everything added up with the Cold Steel SRK, I gave it a 49. So that's my conclusion for the mid-size survival knife showdown. You guys think? I'd like to hear your all's opinion. You know, keep the comments all civil and everything, but I'm going to conclude this. I'm going to probably start moving on to some other reviews and stuff, and some of these knives I'm going to have to move on to just specific reviews on them. So with all that being said, be prepared both physically and spiritually God bless and carry on.